Good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. Before we continue our discussion this morning of the tribulation and its relationship to the resurrection and its relationship to the judgment on Israel, I want to remind you, hey, we've only got a few days left for you to take advantage of the very special introductory price of my brand new book entitled The Death of Adam, the Life of Christ. I've got to tell you, pardon me, I'm just so thrilled with the response to this book. I'm getting comments. I got a comment just the other day that from one gentleman who said, I'm reading this book, it's turning my entire paradigm upside down, but it's right there. The truth is right there. I got an email just this morning from an individual telling me essentially the very same thing. He said, I've been watching your YouTubes, I've been reading your material, and he said, I don't find a way out of what you're saying. And on the testimonials are going of people who've been reading this book and saying that this is just mind-blowing, that it is totally convincing, that it is so thorough in its approach, and I tried to be. Although there was a lot of material I just did not include for time's sake. But the point being, the book is really having a positive impact. Now remember, regular price of the book, $19.95, but for the rest of October 2019, total delivered price to you, all right, $17.95. There, go to my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com. There's a banner right up at the top. All you got to do is click on it, and it'll guide you right through it, a piece of cake. Now, as I mentioned, I cannot make this special offer on overseas orders. The shipping is just too much, even Canada, South America. But if you'd like a PDF copy of this book, with the condition you don't copy it, you don't share it, at a greatly reduced price, just get a hold of me and I'll help you out that way. Okay, well, we are continuing our examination. What I've been doing is sharing with you that in Matthew chapter 24, when Jesus said the abomination of desolation was going to come in that generation, leading directly to the Great Tribulation, this is nothing less than, it's nothing other than, in reality, a prediction that the resurrection was going to be in that first century generation. Now, I've got to tell you, I was raised as an amillennialist. I believed, I heard preacher after preacher talking about how the Great Tribulation, the abomination, that all belonged to the first century. That all had to do with the siege and the destruction of Jerusalem, the end of the Jewish economy. But of course, when they come to the doctrine of the resurrection, that's the end of time. It was absolutely incredibly stunning, shocking, challenging to me to discover the direct, inseparable connection between the tribulation and the resurrection, and the inseparable bond between judgment on Israel, Old Covenant Israel, the tribulation, and the resurrection. Now, I've already shared with you. Men like Greg Beale, Sam Frost, they say the Great Tribulation started in the first century. It's been going on ever since. Well, let me remind you one more time that if the Great Tribulation has been going on ever since the first century, that absolutely demands that Israel has been under unprecedented attack and covenantal curse ever since the first century. Now that's an amazing doctrine, is it not? But I want to continue for the next couple of lessons, and then we'll move on to demonstrate this connection between judgment on Israel, tribulation, resurrection. Because this, as I stated, this is just incredibly important. Because you see, when amillennialists and postmillennialists admit, as I did, that the Great Tribulation was in the first century, having to do with the events involving the siege and the destruction of Jerusalem, the end of Old Covenant Israel, when they admit that was back then, they are tacitly admitting that the resurrection is fulfilled. Hosea. You know, down through the years, I've come to absolutely love the book of Hosea. I've come to believe the book of Hosea is paradigmatic for Paul's doctrine of the resurrection. And I know that because in his magnum opus on the resurrection, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, he begins with a citation from Hosea, and he ends the chapter with a citation of Hosea, which means he's using an inclusio. And that basically that means everything from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 1, all the way to the end of the chapter is all about the fulfillment of Hosea. That's what's known as an inclusio. You begin with a citation from a book, you close with a citation of the book. That lets the reader, the Hebraic reader, know this book is about Hosea. And of course Daniel and of course Isaiah, which he cites, but particularly Hosea. Now, we could really go into detail here, but I won't do that. I just want to focus on Hosea chapter 13. Hosea chapter 13, verse 1. When Ephraim spoke trembling, he exalted himself in Israel. But when he offended through Baal worship, he died, yet he sinned more and more. Now, two things jump out at us here. Number one, this is talking about corporate sin, therefore corporate death. Number two, the death is clearly not biological death, because when Ephraim died, he kept on sinning. That's pretty clear, isn't it? Physically dead people cannot keep on sinning. Now, obviously, this is speaking of the judgment that was coming on Israel under the Assyrians that happened in 721 BC. But the New Testament writers, as I've already mentioned, make application and say that it was being fulfilled ultimately. In other words, what happened in Hosea was typological of the last days. So, the Lord spoke to Israel, and he says, well, for time, I've got to jump over down to verse 12. The iniquity of Ephraim is bound up. His sin is stored up. Now, that has to do with the filling up the measure of sin, which happened in the first century. Now watch this. The sorrows of a woman in childbirth shall come upon him. He is an unwise son. He shall not stay long where children are born. Here are the birth pangs that we've talked about in depth. The birth pangs are the Great Tribulation. That's the way the Jews viewed it. That's the way that they defined it and described it. So here, in Hosea chapter 13 and verse 12, the time of the birth pangs is the time of the Great Tribulation. Well, remember, Jesus in Matthew chapter 24, talking about the events coming, wars, rumors of wars, famine, earthquakes, pestilence, etc., the abomination of desolation. He said these are the birth pangs coming on Israel. Well, what would the birth pangs produce? The kingdom, resurrection. Notice Hosea 13:14. I will ransom them from the power of the grave. I will redeem them from death. O death, I will be your plagues. O grave, I will be your destruction. Tribulation, resurrection. Oh, but wait, it's not some kind of a generic tribulation. It is tribulation on Israel for violating covenant. And thus, when we come to Matthew chapter 24, and we find Jesus talking about the birth pangs, we find Jesus talking about the tribulation, and then talking about his coming at the sounding of the great trumpet, that's resurrection. And he said, verily I say unto you, this generation will by no means pass away until all of these things are fulfilled. And, of course, I'm just absolutely stunned at the verbal and linguistic gymnastics that some people try to pull when they say, well, this generation means this family or this tribe of people. Nope, sorry. This kind of people. Nope, sorry. Doesn't work. That is linguistically untenable. But do you see the power of the connection between judgment on Israel, tribulation, resurrection? That connection is absolutely unbreakable. Therefore, since Jesus posited the Great Tribulation, the birth pangs, for the first century generation, since Hosea posited the birth pangs on Israel for violation of Torah, since Jesus posited the Great Tribulation and the abomination on Israel for violation of Torah, that means it all goes together. And that means the resurrection was for the first century. And you know what that means? It means you cannot divide Matthew chapter 24. It's not broken up into two discussions of the fall of Jerusalem, judgment on Israel, as opposed to an end of time. It's one subject, the last days of Israel, when the Great Tribulation would come as a result of her abominable actions, resulting in the coming of the Lord, the judgment, and the resurrection in the first century. Well, yeah, I've got a whole lot more, so I'll see you on the flip side.